Hello, I'm a spinning grey cube and I'd like to talk to you about politics in the UK. You spend any amount of time on YouTube looking at political stuff and it's hard not to get sucked into the mesmerising clusterfuck in the US at the moment. But that's not where I live. So I began to ask myself, what is there here about British politics? But then I realised that I was the wrong person to ask, since I didn't know the answer. And I already knew I didn't know the answer, so I asked Google. And I found this.
Stephen Edgington here from Politics UK.
Politics UK channel run by a bloke who describes himself as centre-right and a pro-Brexit student. So I thought I'd take one of his videos and spout contrarian nonsense and cheap jokes over it, because this is YouTube and on this platform, that's how we roll. So this video is called Young People Get Over Brexit, and it's actually the latest video on his channel, even though you might think that people had got over telling other people to get over Brexit about 12 months ago. But Brexit is like a black hole. All politics slows down the closer you get to it. So since pretty much nothing else can happen until we get over this, what else has he got to talk about? And for my part, I'm happy to take this on purely on the basis that I'm probably not smart enough to form any cohesive argument against something I haven't already been talking about for 18 months. Now, what was your name again?
My name's Stephen Edgington. I'm young, I'm metropolitan, I'm middle class, and I campaigned for Brexit. That's right, I spent my weekends hitting the streets, handing out leaflets talking about the positives of leaving the European Union.
Okay, were these real positives, or was it just that shit they made up about the NHS?
Isn't it odd how 70% of my millennial generation voted to remain in the EU? Because when you look at youth movements around the world, throughout history, they've pioneered political revolutions. When you look at students in Tiananmen Square in China, but it's really interesting that my generation, instead of having the first chance to enact a political revolution, decided to support the establishment.
So Brexit was like the Tiananmen Square protests. Yeah, the thing about the Tiananmen Square protests is they weren't led by notable anti-establishment figures like Nigel Farage, a crypto-racist multi-millionaire Monorchid ex-city trader. And just as an aside here, if you don't know what Monorchid means, look it up, and I hope you get just as much joy as I did from finding out that Nigel Farage is one. Now, is it fair to call Nigel Farage a crypto-racist? Yes. And there was Boris Johnson, because nothing says anti-establishment more than being school chums with the Prime Minister at Eton, does it? If this was some kind of populist revolution, then I really think Boris Johnson would have been first up against the wall when the insurgents won, instead of, say, promoted to Foreign Secretary. I mean, we can still dream, but so far no luck. Okay, what's next?
Over the last 43 years, the European Union has become increasingly bureaucratic and increasingly less democratic, and for me that's a real problem, because it means as a voter I don't have a say on so many different issues. I can't hire and fire the leaders in the European Commission who propose those laws.
The EU basically consists of a parliament, which we elect just like our own parliament. We don't get a say in everyone there, but then I don't get a say in who the MP for Inverness is. There's a council of ministers appointed by national leaders, just like our own ministers are, who then appoint people to the Commission. So it's not actually that different from the way members of the House of Lords or the Cabinet get their jobs. I mean, nobody voted for Jeremy Hunt to be Health Minister, did they? If voters got to choose Jeremy Hunt's job, he would be cleaner of the Royal Piranha Aquarium. Now this next point may be a little bit controversial, but last time we had a referendum in the UK, it was in 2011, on whether to switch to a fairer, more representative voting system than the first past the post system. And nobody gave a shit about democratic control then. The turnout was a full 30% lower than it was for the Brexit referendum. So anybody who said it's not about xenophobia, it's about taking back control this time around, but didn't vote in that referendum back in 2011, basically doesn't give a shit about taking back control unless it's taking back control from dirty foreigners, and therefore it totally was about xenophobia. And Stephen, if you do watch this, I don't blame you for this. I realise that you were still a zygote back then and not old enough to vote.
Immigration is one of those sort of dirty words among my generation, but we need to talk about it. It has depressed wages among low-skilled jobs, and many of those jobs are taken up by young people. The Bank of England says a 10% increase in migration leads to a 2% decrease in wages for those in the lowest paid jobs.
Okay, so that's wrong. Both the Telegraph article and the Bank of England report it refers to are only actually talking about a specific list of low-paid service sector roles. But you have fucked this up far less egregiously than Boris Johnson, who claimed, based on this same Bank of England report, that it applied to all wages at all levels. So, respect to you, because I think if we all manage to live our lives by the rule, fuck up less egregiously than Boris Johnson, the world will be a much better place. Now, the reason why this is important is that if the economy as a whole tanks, there are a whole lot of ways that people could end up less well off in real terms, despite having higher wages. For example, inflation, higher food costs, public spending cuts, and of course the possibility that there could be less of these low-paid service sector jobs to go round.
And in a time where demand is extremely high for houses and basic public services, surely cutting immigration can only be a good thing for my generation.
Okay, I only include this clip here because I've recently read Daniel Dennett's book where he says that if you look in any article for the word surely, that's where you'll find the weakest part of the argument. Certainly in the case of the NHS, this isn't true. The NHS is hugely dependent on immigrants. 20% of NHS doctors are immigrants. Basically, the NHS would be screwed without immigration.
Jeremy Corbyn has recently announced that he wants to stay in a customs union, meaning Britain won't have any control over our tariffs that we set on external goods or over trade deals that we make around the world. Goods that we import from other countries will be artificially high in terms of cost. So for example, the EU sets tariffs on oranges. There aren't any orange farms in the UK.
Yes, I jump cut that. Trust me, I didn't misrepresent anything. So in this country, about half our oranges come from Spain. There's also blood oranges from Italy, and the rest of it's from outside EU. Only the ones that come from outside the EU are affected by that tariff. Once we leave the EU, we will no longer need to pay an import tariff on oranges from South Africa, which is where most of them come from. Although, conversely, Spain will be able to charge an export tariff on oranges they send to us. Although I'll admit they probably won't. And you know what? When I first decided to make this video, I did so because I hoped it would help me to myself learn more about British politics. But in actual fact, the only thing I've learnt more about is the international orange trade.
My generation simply aren't convinced. They've got in their brain that that the EU is this brilliant block where you can go and live and travel and work for free abroad. Well, in fact, you can do that to most countries anyway. Visa-free travel is massively increasing.
Ooh, sneaky bait and switch there. There are plenty of places you can visit without a visa, but live and work, not so much, you know? And are those amount of places increasing? Well, obviously, if we leave the EU, they very much are not.
And most people don't even have the opportunity or the chance to do these things anyway. You know, we love to go abroad to travel on holiday, but most people don't even go and live and work outside the continent, or on the continent even.
Well, you know, I've never had the opportunity to take advantage of my right to a trial by jury. That doesn't mean I'd be happy to lose it. If I was accused of the murder of Roger Ackroyd of Fernley Park, King's Abbot, for example. No reason why I mention that name. I have lots of friends who have lived and worked in the EU. I have friends who are doing so now, and I have a lot of friends from the EU who are working in this country at the moment. It's a great way to broaden your mind if you're too lazy to travel like myself.
For once, stop complaining to older generations who you say stole your future. It's simply not true. The older people, they voted for a revolution that you really crave, that you've craved for years.
Okay, the thing about revolutions is, not all revolutions are created equal. I'd rather have a prince in the revolution than an Iranian revolution, for example. In fact, my preferred form of revolution would be Hermione Granger walking into the offices of the Daily Mail with a magic wand in her hand and just going full Voldemort on their asses.
Jeremy Corbyn.
What? I thought we were talking about Brexit.
Jeremy Corbyn is not the answer to young people's problems. In fact, he is the problem. He will create more debt. He will drag us back to the 1970s.
Okay, pro tip here. If you're under the age of 50, don't say something will take you back to the 1970s, because you clearly have no idea what you're talking about. I was around in the 70s, just about, and all I really remember is that Lego was a lot more affordable. Now, the idea that a government debt will spiral out of control under a Labour government is not a new thing for Corbyn. It's the reason why my gran said she would never vote Labour, and she died before Mr Edgington here was born. So what I'd say about the deficit is three things. Firstly, under the Conservative government, it's soared to unprecedented levels. Secondly, if you actually look at the performance of Labour versus Conservative governments at controlling the deficit over the last 50 years, Labour have actually done better. And thirdly, the deficit really isn't that big a deal if you have economic growth and good employment. It's just a thing the Tories like to make a big deal out of as an excuse for things like austerity. Do you remember how in the last election the Tories kept saying there's no magic money tree, and then they lost their majority, so they had to bribe the DUP with £1 billion that they found on the magic money tree? Deficit, not that big a deal.
So please, be positive about Brexit. Stop complaining. Stop wanting older people to die off. Stop arguing for a second referendum. It's not going to happen. 17.4 million people voted for Brexit. You've got to get behind democracy and say, look, we're going to engage with the opportunities of Brexit, the positives of Brexit, and we're going to make it a success for young people.
Yeah, alternatively, keep complaining. I mean, that's pretty much what politics is about. 17 million people didn't vote for a hard Brexit or a soft Brexit or a red, white and blue Brexit. They voted for what was on offer, which was an extra 350 million a week for the NHS. They voted for a have your cake and eat it Brexit. And now the right wing of the Tory party wants to take that cake, give it to a baby and then throw it out with the bathwater. That makes sense, doesn't it? Basically, there's a bunch of protests coming up on the 24th of March, the anniversary of the triggering of Article 50. So take to the streets, wave a placard, burn a macrame effigy of Jacob Rees-Mogg, whatever. Probably won't do any good. We won't get a second referendum or a vote on the deal in Parliament, but maybe, just maybe, it will remind our government that there's still a few of us out here who would prefer it if they could drive their big red leave bus of lies off a slightly lower cliff. Like and subscribe if you want to. There's a possibility that if you do, I'll make another video.